Hey everybody, I hope you're well. So I'm about to do a little presentation video, lecture video on moral relativism, the first section in chapter 6. Before you watch this video, be sure and watch the previous videos on the introduction to moral philosophy and metaethics, which is posted up at the top of the page. And be sure and go ahead and watch the information on the remaining short answer assignments as well, since there's kind of an added step or two that you need to do for those this time around. Okay, so after you've watched those, come back here. Otherwise, let's go ahead and start on moral relativism. So this is our first metaethical position, right, that we're going to look at. We're going to look at a couple of arguments for this view, but the basic view is that it's a metaethical theory that denies the possibility of any kind of objective or universal moral truths. And what I mean by moral truth there, again, is a prescriptive truth. So claims about how we ought behave, according to this view, are not universal or objective. They are only true insofar as we can talk. I'm going to use hand quotes here. Only true insofar as they might be binding on members of a particular culture, right? So at particular times and particular places, or cultural consensus. So in other words, the idea that if we can talk about moral prescriptive truths at all, we should only talk about them in terms of being relative to or dependent upon a current cultural consensus. So that's the basic idea of the view, and we'll look at a couple of arguments for this position, as well as some criticisms. Of course, you kind of know the deal by now. So let's start out with just a couple of examples from popular culture, right? So again, this is a very old view of morality. Some of the first historians and first thinkers to start writing stuff down in Western history talked about this view of the idea of morality being rooted in culture or folk ways, as Bernard Sumner talks about them. And again, we get this idea illustrated in lots of different movies. So in Planet of the Apes, this is the remake here of the classic movie. In ape culture, the treatment of humans is permissible. It's permissible to keep them as pets or as servants, right? And then in human culture on the alternative planet, it's okay to lock monkeys up, right? So the book, your textbook also uses Hotel Rwanda to illustrate this idea. So the idea of a universal human right it is kind of represented in the film in terms of the UN, which is based on the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. And one of those rights is that you shouldn't be slaughtered based on your ethnicity. And so the show talks about, a genocide as being challenged to universal human rights in that way. Other movies that we might look at with regard to this theory, Do the Right Thing. You kind of have a clash within subcultures of a particular general culture in that film. You've got the Joy Luck Club, so you've got different generations of a family change as they move to different cultures. So you have kind of people that immigrate to a particular culture, to the U.S. from a Japanese culture, and then the second generation are more assimilated to the newer culture rather than the older culture. And then for some fictional examples, again, from pop culture, you've got some differences illustrated in Game of Thrones. I don't know about y'all, but I've never been to a wedding reception where people were expected to get murdered, and it would be considered a boring or a dull affair if there weren't at least 3 deaths. So those are different fictional examples, but moral norms or cultural norms that are different between cultures. So that kind of illustrates this notion of cultural relativism. Your book defines cultural relativism as basically the empirical fact of diversity with regard to morality between cultures, right? And then moral relativism, the book uses that as the phrase for the metaethical position that is thought to follow from the cultural differences, the empirical differences that we see between cultures. So it's no shock to us to look around the world and see that there are what appear to be, in some cases, radical differences between cultures over morality, over right conduct. And so in France several years ago, there was a clash between you know, what the French culture thought of as universal human rights, and thought of particular cultural traditions with regard to dress as violating those human rights. On the other side, some people thought that choosing how to dress to represent your religion was a universal human right. So you got a pretty hairy situation there. So your textbook gives the first reading out of the textbook, the primary source reading at the beginning of the chapter, uses William Graham Sumner, who was an anthropologist. They use him as an example of a moral relativist, someone who argued for moral relativism on the basis of cultural differences. And we'll look at two different arguments here. The first one, the cultural differences argument, we get a version of that out of Sumner here. So this comes out of some selections out of his book on folkways, and I've just pulled out a couple of quotations here from that reading. So he says, in the folkways, the folkways are right, the right ways to satisfy, the morally right ways to satisfy interest, right? So folkways or customs or traditions, they vary according to place and time. So these folkways extend over the whole life. There's a right way to catch game, to win a wife, to make oneself appear, to cure disease, to honor ghosts, to treat comrades or strangers, to behave when a child is born or when you're on the warpath, in council, and so on in all cases which arise. They are defined on the negative side, that is by taboos. So a taboo is, you know, something you're not, according to which you're, the culture, you're not supposed to do, right? So the right way is that which is the ancestors used and which is handed down by tradition, right? In the tradition is its own warrant, and it's not held to subject. It's not held to subject to verification by experience, right? So the idea here is there's no independent standard of right and wrong. The standards are just in those cultural traditions. And so he says the notion of right, and again he's talking about moral right, moral permissibility, moral obligation, moral impermissibility or taboo, is in the folkways. It's not outside of them or of independent origin and brought to them to test them. In the folkways, whatever is right is right. This is because they are traditional and therefore contain in themselves the authority of ancestral goats, or the authority of tradition. That's what he's saying. And so ethnocentrism then is just the name for the view in which one group's view is presupposed to be the correct view, and all others are evaluated according to that one particular culture's standards. So he says, when therefore ethnographers or anthropologists, when they apply condemnatory claims or evaluations to other traditions, they're begging the question that the anthropologists want to investigate. And that is, what are the standards, codes, or ideas of chastity, decency, propriety, modesty, etc., and whence do they arise? So he says that immoral never means anything other than contrary to the mores of time and place, right? So the mores of a particular culture constitute the morality of that culture, the standards about how we ought behave. So here's our first argument for moral relativism. What's called the textbook, and many people call this the cultural differences argument, or the sorry, I have to discipline my cat real quick. He's trying to get my headphones off the shelf over there. Sorry about that. It's the joys of working from home, right? So the textbook mentions this cultural differences argument. Sometimes in other places, other literature, you might see that called the cultural disagreement argument for moral relativism, and I just have a little version of that, a conversational version of that argument set up here. So here's how the argument goes. There are no cross-cultural universal standards of morality or moral truths, right? And again, by a moral truth here, we mean a prescriptive or a normative truth. Remember, meta-ethics is about the status of prescriptive claims or statements. Are they relative or universal, right? Subjective or objective? If there were such standards, we wouldn't find such widespread differences between cultures when it comes to what counts as good and bad conduct, or right and wrong conduct. But when we look at history and around the world today, we see that different cultures have different standards of right conduct. For example, in contemporary America, slavery is considered wrong, but previously in American history, there was institutional slavery, which was not only considered moral, but also legal. right? So sometimes there's a difference between legality and morality, but in this case, these were considered both moral institutions and legally permissible institutions. So likewise, Americans think that they have the right to determine if and whom they marry. But some cultures still practice arranged marriages and even forced marriages. Some cultures even practice honor killings for infidelity and immodesty, which are hardly considered punishable by death in developed Western societies that emphasize individual rights and individual freedoms. So there are no cross-cultural universal moral standards. Since there are no universal moral standards, morality is based on cultural consensus, which varies according to place and time. And so that's the cultural differences argument, or cultural disagreement argument for morality. The basic idea of the argument is to go from the empirical fact that there is moral diversity between cultures over morality to the meta-ethical claim that there are no universal moral truths, right? And then further to claim that moral claims are relative to or dependent to particular times and places, or relative to current cultural consensus. And so that's the basic idea of the argument there. As practice for your short answer assignments, what you ought to do is take this passage here and reconstruct it as a deductively valid argument. Or you could look in the textbook and use the argument as it's presented there and extract it from the paragraphs and then formulate it as a proper form, deductively valid argument. So I'll pause here to give you a chance to work on that activity. So just take a minute and try and formulate that argument.